Hi, welcome back to the Film London Jarman Award Whitechapel weekend, live online at the Whitechapel Gallery. My name is Greta Hewison and I'm the production coordinator at Film London Artist Moving Image Network, and we organise the Film London Jarman Award. I really hope that you enjoyed hearing from Sophia Al-Maria earlier on this afternoon, and next we'll be hearing from shortlisted artist Jasmina Cibic. But before I introduce her, I wanted to again mention just a few housekeeping points. We're really pleased that we have captions available for all of the presentations this afternoon, and you can switch those on and off if you need them by toggling the button subtitles/closed captions on the bottom right-hand side of the YouTube window. After we hear from Jasmina, we'll be going straight into a half-an-hour break. And we encourage you to use this break to explore the work of the shortlisted artists that we currently have featured on the Whitechapel Gallery website. If you're watching from the Whitechapel Gallery website, great. All you need to do is scroll down and you'll see the 6 works made available there. If you're watching via YouTube, you'll need to click over to the Whitechapel Gallery website, find the Film London Jarman Award programme on the events page, and then click the button that says Launch Weekend Hub page, and you'll find the works there. We're really pleased to say that all of those works also have captions that can be switched on and off if you need them, apart from Georgina Starr's work, Quarantine, which doesn't have captions because it doesn't feature any dialogue. After the break, we will reconvene for the final presentation of the afternoon, and that is Guy Oliver's lecture performance. I'm really excited for that, so I hope you stick around. So a little bit about Jasmina Cibic. With a practice spanning performance, installation, and film, Jasmina Cibic considers how ideologies and cultures are constructed and then framed through mechanisms such as art and architecture. Her work explores the construction of national culture and how it can be used for political aims, and looks particularly at forms of soft power. I really hope that you enjoy this in-conversation. Thank you so much for being here, and hopefully see you again after the break.
Your proposal must inject a new philosophy. We do not want a selective appropriation of history.
Or civility in the face of ideologies that will terrify our grandchildren.
Our gift needs to echo how technological progress has decorated our entire social life. Your duty is defined.
Political style is obsolete.
Why do people hate us? They think we feel culturally and intellectually superior, that we are fat, greedy, and lazy elites. Our gift must address this.
My name is Jasmina Cibic, and welcome to my presentation of the work for the 2021 Jarman Award. I will be presenting my film, The Gift, of which you just saw the trailer, and I will be focusing on the construction of the entire project, research behind it, and I have invited iLiana Fokianaki to be in conversation with me to further open the ideas and thoughts that the project channels. And to start, I did want to introduce some images of the previous installs of other works alongside The Gift, as these works are always parts of quite larger research projects, including publications, installations, and performances.
People of Europe, create for yourselves sacred possessions.
my work centers on the relationship between culture and political power, and my research-based projects exist in their final form as immersive film installations that merge performance and theatrical setups. I always draw upon archives and historical readymades, which mostly focus on selections of scenographic backdrops that reference state-endorsed architecture and cultural production in service of national and transnational identity production. In this, I aim to address the timelessness of soft power mechanisms that authoritarian patriarchal structures utilize in their continued reinvention. And of course, I'm mostly drawn to case studies where culture is one of the preferred methodologies in achieving that, especially as we are stuck in a moment of time where the politics of cultural capital, especially national cultural capital, and the role of society within it are being rewritten. For this year's Jarman Award, I chose to present to you my latest film titled The Gift, which reaches into examples of political gifts of culture that were all deployed as Trojan horses of political and national power for covert diplomacy and political interest. The Gift distills decades of my research of soft power into a single artistic sentiment, really, one that simply states how universal and timeless the hijacking of culture by ideology is. The film exists as a 30-minute, 3-channel gallery installation, and also as a single-channel film, which you can access on the Jarman Award Tour website, and you'll see today as well. So the 3-channel gallery installation is currently on view at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Lyon, until January 22. At the center of this heavily research-based project lies the questioning of culture as a political gift. So I have been tracing historical case studies of this concept throughout some of the most pertinent moments of European identity crisis over the past 100 years. The film takes these references and rearticulates them as diverse structural and narrative parts of the project. So it effectively weaves them into elements of the storyline, locations, dialogue, characters, and choreography. I have filmed exclusively within architectures, which were political gifts themselves, and that present some of the best examples of diplomatic and political cases of culture deployed in servitude of politics. So the locations include the French Communist headquarters in Paris, whose design is a gift from its architect, Oscar Niemeyer, the Palace of the Nations in Geneva, which is a gift from the city, and its interiors are comprised from gifts by members of the League of Nations. Then we have the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw, which was a present from Stalin to the new Soviet state of Poland, and Mount Budujla, which is a citizen-founded tribute to the socialist movement in Bulgaria. The buildings that feature within the film merge into a singular architectural edifice, which really pours forth as one of the central protagonists of the film. But at the same time, it also becomes a cinematographic device itself that channels all movement and life of the characters. The story of the film begins inside the Palace of Youth, which is the pool built within the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw, where we see 3 young girls climb onto the diving platforms as announcers of a new spectacular competition which is created by an unknown authority. This is a competition that seeks the perfect gift for a divided nation. A gift, as we hear narrated by the voiceover, that must be both aesthetically impressive and politically adequate. The competition takes place within, let's say, a perfect setting, so an open, transparent assembly hall that appears to break with the burden of antiquated political style, so cuts away from the past, propels itself into the future. And this is, of course, the Niemeyer Paris PCF headquarters. And within the setup, we meet the 4 judges. These are the 4 fundamental freedoms, which are concepts that I drafted from a Franklin Roosevelt speech inciting Americans to enter the Second World War. These are the freedoms from fear, from want, of speech, and worship. So the 4 women summon 3 male allegories to take part: an artist, an engineer, and a diplomat. And each of the men deliver a monologue describing their vision and version of instrumentalized culture as that perfect gift which can hold such special powers. The men's rhetorical presentations draw from nation-building speeches by past and present politicians, diplomats, architects, and artists. So I would say that the research behind the gift engages with forms of tokenistic political gestures and illustrations. It really aims to connect various historical and even ideologically contrived buildings and their inhabitants, so from political parties, unions, heads of state, for their common entanglement with the economy of gifting, and also the unwritten need of the return of a retribution gift, so to the nation, citizens, and the international community. The film intends to present a much needed inquiry into how culture has been perceived and utilized, not only as a pawn in permutations of soft power strategies, but also how it is itself implicit in the production of the spectre of political and national power. So I would like to invite iLiana to join me in a conversation. iLiana is a curator, theorist, and educator who is based in Athens and Rotterdam. And her research focuses on formations of power and how they manifest under the influence of geopolitics, national identity, and cultural and anthropological histories. iLiana founded the State of Concept Athens in 2013, which is the first nonprofit institution of its kind in Greece, and she directs it to this day. She has also curated exhibitions for Cadiz Foundation, La Colonie Paris, IFLAX New York, Museum of Contemporary Art Ljubljana, and she's currently co-curating a group exhibition for Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid. Her book, Gossips, will be published in 2022. Hello, iLiana.
Okay, so hello, Jasmina, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you, Jarman, as well for the invitation. I wanted to really start from your last sentence, like how culture is perceived and utilized, but not only as a pawn, but you know, kind of highlighting the implicitness. Culture as an active agent in performing and propagating for power, and specifically soft power. Because I think specifically the second part, you know, being an implicit agent, an active agent, is not one that is discussed enough, maybe, and not one that is admitted enough by all of us that are in the cultural sector, or maybe it's not conscious enough. And I wanted your thoughts a little bit on that, specifically given how the landscape is transforming the last 4 or 5 years in terms of all these discourses and questions and thematics.
Yeah, it's a wonderful, I think, opening question. Thank you, iLiana. And it's also really pertinent, I think, both for the medium and you know, the context of artistic moving image, which, you know, we all know it's always been very, very hard to pull off. And now it's even more difficult, and it is actually more difficult because of second guessing of artistic institutions and also of funding. So here we kind of go back to this double game of soft power that I really like to play with. So it's not just that soft power itself and the kind of use value of culture for political national aims is the kind of centerfold of the projects, but I really like to delegate this responsibility with the actual players that hold the sufficient access to the grants, let's say. And of course, you know, because we are in the context of Brexit Britain, loads of artistic practices that are dealing with contexts that are perhaps now not of interest to the, you know, to the funding which is available in this country, are getting even more and more marginalized. I was listening to a podcast 2 days ago on Arts and Ideas, and they were asking a few directors of museums about how the pandemic has shifted their spectatorship. And the director of the National Gallery was saying, well, 70% of their audiences it was an international audience. So
coming from the tourist industry, of course.
Exactly. Exactly. Now he kind of has to rejig the collection to suit local and national interest. So this is this question, you know, and how are we as cultural producers, how can we factor this in with resilience? This is, I guess, the question that I really, you know, think that we should be debating, especially with students, especially with young artists, and how they will co-shape the future of the cultural capital. So is there a way of actually having this ping pong machine fully functional, or are we just content providers for then, the authority and the gatekeepers to decide, to second guess, and to just draw upon what is currently the illustration that suits the soft power of the chosen context?
Yeah, and I think for me, it's in a very kind of crude and basic way, is to begin really understanding the mechanism of that, and then the role that you can have in usurping it somehow and producing contents. Obviously, we are the ones that are delivering the content, but the question always, of course, is in what terms, through what pathways, and with what hidden messages as well do we do that. And I think this is one of the reasons that I'm so fond of your work as well, because you directly, let's say, perform soft power as such through the work that you do. We've discussed this in the past, I think, this kind of mirror image that you offer by really fleshing out the skeleton and the operating machine behind, culture, which usually has governments, states, nation states kind of having, let's say, strategies of how to promote their messages through culture. And you really use this mechanism to unmask somehow these forms of power, and thus performing it and creating, maybe we can say as well, a counter narrative of soft power. So how the artist in a way can become an agitator, can become a counter propaganda machine in that sense, which I think is very interesting. But I would also say that specifically when it comes to the gift, what I'm interested in is the very specific historical period that you're looking into, which is kind of a period, let's say, that these types, the manifestations of power in relationship also to nation state building, to the idea of the nation state as such, is shifting quite fast. So after Second World War ends until, let's say, 2000, when, of course, in the late 90s, we have, the European Union and the euro occurring and everything, the Maastricht treaty and everything. I think we see a lot of steps in terms of how soft power reveals itself to the public. And specifically these years, I think we've discussed it as well before with the non-aligned movement, like 1940s until 1970s are very rich years in terms of how, this is refined, these soft powers and their performativities, let's say, they're refined. So that's what I found very interesting, that you chose a very specific period. And I wanted to ask you a little bit in relationship to that as well, like what made you focus in these manifestations, let's say, of soft power?
Yeah, no,
logically wise, right?
To go a step back, it's exactly, it is this double game of sort of giving this kind of mirror image back to the power itself. And I guess I always found it a bit useless to try and, scream, with everybody else screaming, if you know what I mean. So I always kind of wanted to enter into these sort of spaces of power and actually, repeat their own code of messaging. So I always kind of utilize the same codes of messaging, or the same alphabets that I would find within those sort of spaces of production of power, because I feel that that's actually then interesting, because you can kind of re-articulate the whole system and kind of recompose it, which is kind of the hard way to do it, but it's much more interesting because I really try to get then those very spaces. So if we kind of speak now more specifically, for example, with a gift, it was the United Nations in Geneva, so the Palace of the Nations, to try and get them as an institution to actually be playing this sort of this game with me, to kind of try and open sort of hidden drawers of archives that have not been activated, used, and why not if they haven't, and so on. And yeah, sometimes we were talking about this in the past as well. Sometimes these institutions are actually quite willing to have these discussions, even though they are kind of coming from artistic research, not historical research. But yeah, just back to the whole space or the timelines of inquiry. You're absolutely right. It's so the kind of second half of the 20th century is the one which is extremely, I would say, pregnant with potential for this kind of re-examination and recovery also of past potential. Actually quite feminist sort of rewritings of the system. I always really like to cite the Brussels World Exposition of 1958, which was the first world exposition after the last big trauma of Europe, so of the Second World War, where countries really had the time to gather momentum, raise funds, and rethink how they will come on the platform of the new world relations with this new scenography. So this is where I just find it is a very clear illustration of these mechanisms function, because they always function and they're nothing new. They've been around forever. But it's perhaps the most sort of, or one of the most sort of potent examples for us to just look at it and observe it and kind of go, aha, yes, this is very clear. So you kind of have, Germany rewriting its history through repeating the architecture of a pavilion by Mies van der Rohe instead of the Nazi architecture of Speer from the previous expo. So we have this kind of very clear illustrations of political scenography, not only with the architecture of the pavilions and the political styling, but also the selection of the culture and color schemes and so on of what was then to go into these pavilions. And it's really this brilliant sort of meeting point of stagecraft and statecraft that is, just really, really succinct, I think. And then when we come to the gift, so initially it was to be, we talked about this as well, initially it was to be an optimistic project, because I wanted to be looking at this secondary or this other economy of exchange, which is this gift economy. So the idea of the gift economy is that you cannot return the gift. So if the gift is culture, you don't give it back. It doesn't have wear and tear. The retribution gift that it produces is social discourse. So, from the outlook, it felt to me, wow, this is fantastic. This is like super positive. It's, it really is just full of, pregnant with potential. And then the more I was starting to dig through historical case studies, I just realized that, so many of them were actually just these Trojan horses. Most of them were just Trojan horses for covert diplomacy and political interest. And this is where I started to really rethink about the producers, the cultural agents themselves, and, how much they were aware, how much they were aware in playing the game. Did they want to play the game? And so at what cost? So for example, the Niemeyer building, which was, on paper, a gift by Niemeyer, by the architect, in exchange, actually, he received an atelier on Champs-Élysées. So, and all these things were kind of like being recovered as we were, going through the project. And also with the United Nations building, all these gifts that comprise the interior were gifts by member states of the League of Nations. But, this was like a wedding book. So what the League did was they just sent out basically like a wedding book with desires of what they need. And it said, curtains, pavement, walls, one mural, and it also shows how tokenistic this exchange was in the eye of the authority. Now, with the League of Nations also, it's just really interesting because they cannot return the gift. So now these gifts are being rewritten by the new scenography, to just finish there. So the new scenography of the colonial Europe is now the scenography of the Middle East. So you have Qatari and UAE coming in to refurbish the palace.
But this is where I wanted to go at, that of course, who has the means to actually provide the elaborate gifts? Who has the means to create these extremely lavish buildings and complicated architectures, which again, if we go back to that period, is the period actually with this terminology of the so-called first world, the so-called second world, the so-called third world is created. The IMF is created during that period. So you have all these like suprastate mechanisms that are also mechanism of supposed alliances and care and aid and comradeship and all these things, when in fact there are just other ways of enacting soft power and other ways of demonstrating different power capabilities and imbalances of power. So for me, it's also very interesting that, to go to the buildings in specific, that architecture plays such an important role in demonstrating the financial superiority of a state. Because of course, you know, who could afford to have a Niemeyer building? Who could afford to build, you know, such and such? And it's very interesting to see also this kind of double-sided coin there. In one hand, it's even countries that wouldn't be able necessarily to afford it, that they stretch themselves in order to be able to get the supreme architect to build something. And those that can very casually do it, you know, can create these like huge constructions that remain to the day examples of excellence, of civilization, of superiority, of financial prosperity. So, and this idea of financial prosperity, I think, is very important, because it really, you know, as I said before, it really begins somewhere there, of this categorization of nations, who can afford what, and therefore what kind of power do they have in order to play a specific role in international politics and diplomacy as well. So that I thought was very interesting. And then on the other hand, again, we've discussed it in the past, the access coming now, of course, to you as an artist, you know, using these as a backdrop for your work, the access to these buildings is another negotiation, is another kind of power play platform somehow of whether you as an artist are allowed. You talked also a bit about the archives, which for me are another demonstration of power. Who's allowed to see them? You said, you know, maybe they were much more open because, of course, you were looking at it through the artistic perspective and not a historical perspective or an anthropological one, where, of course, in 2021, you would have, you know, as a scholar, so many things to say about the way that testimony, archive, history was recorded and instated, sanctioned, or, you know, what have you. And I thought that that was as well interesting in the sense that this is another role of a building, of cement, you know, of access, no access, and power unbalances, let's say.
I think it's a really brilliant point, because, you know, these are the architectures I generally use in my work are all temples of power, but most of the time they're temples of past power verticals. So the client that originally commissioned this building has disappeared. So, you know, my whole sort of play here really is to, you know, to say, well, by liberating this client, by vacating this client, can we now observe this in a different light? So can we observe this, like just turn it upside down, this scenographic machine, and see how it functions with this vacancy? And are there maybe like different, you know, just different structures, different sort of possibilities, different aesthetic possibilities and enactments and behavioral patterns even of just the movement of the bodies through these architectures that are possible?
Because you meant, I mean, going back, you said previously, you mentioned scenography, and now you're saying again, this scenographic machine, that for me, this also is a very interesting point, in the sense that in The Gift, in the film, all these buildings merge into one. They become one continuous backdrop for one story. And I found that super successful as well in the film, in the sense that you somehow are toning down this legacy of power that they hold among their walls, and you're rendering them as a flat surface where you paint your portrait of soft power. So the audience, of course, or the viewer of the film, unless they already are familiar with these buildings or read a wall text before they see the film, or a pamphlet, they wouldn't necessarily understand that we're talking about all these different paradigms of power through architecture. And I found that very successful as well, that you somehow trick them into becoming one thing.
But this was really kind of quite a tricky bit, I guess, because we were really kind of like trying to work with very different political styling, obviously. And, so obviously there's this, it's still a film structure, it's still a cinematographic structure. So you have the style, you have the look, and how do you then merge things which are so, not only formally contrived, ideologically contrived. So you kind of, by merging these things together. So this was the risk, let's say. This was the risk, and how to kind of make this work. And I am really, really happy that we managed, because it had to be those buildings. So I was really looking for buildings which were built within the kind of key moments of European crisis in the 20th century, really. So this was kind of, I really wanted to kind of do this historical sweep in a way of these moments of also the attempts of transnationalism, or just some form of sort of potentiality of solidarity, and kind of go through that lens. So it is very specific buildings, and it was amazing. We managed to get them all on board to give us the access, to present, also a very, open book project to them. We were very, very open to them with what we were trying to achieve. And, back to the archives, I always say that artistic research it can be quite dangerous, if it's misappropriated, because, I always say I am not a historian. So, how I access archives, how I deal with archives, it is artistic research. And this is quite different. And I think it's a really good point that you're saying, that also a lot of the times archives might say yes to an artist, but they might not say yes to an anthropological researcher, because they don't deem us dangerous. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
So
this is what I find beautiful, that of course you have this little window of opportunity of actually, sneaking in a way, or being allowed in, because again, this is kind of the power structures and manifestations of power, being allowed in because you are thought of as harmless.
Yeah.
Going to have an imaginary translation of what have you, and then being able to actually deliver a message that lays bare the problematics of all these operations.
I had the conversations with the director of the UN Library and Archive. He was also involved with loads of studies on soft power, and he totally got what we were doing. And I was so amazed that he understood, and he said, yes, please, these are the questions that need to be asked. Where it's not even about the bilateral, it's about the multilateral soft power instances, which is really not researched. And so this was, it kind of felt there is this potentiality to be opening up. But then, of course, we have this, again, the double-edged sword of how diplomacy and political power looks upon culture. They don't want the critical culture, they don't want the critical production, they don't know what to do with it, And I think this is also what I always found quite a strange frisson, because historically, if we look again, going back to this famous 1958 in Brussels, politicians were sitting at the table, really deciding on the avant-garde movements, on, really saying not only that the facade has to be forward-looking, amazing, modernist design with a, big stamp of the architect's name, but the content was foreground-looking and avant-garde.
Yeah, which is something, for instance, that you can say many times we see it lacking. Now, there was a moment again somewhere in the 90s, but I think a general turn to conservative politics after the financial crisis of 2008, if we look at the European terrain, well, it's not just the European terrain, because of course we have examples of Trump and Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's a global phenomenon of what I call narcissistic authoritarian statism, is a kind of elected officials that represent this kind of authoritarian regime, but of course with a very narcissistic tendency. But we lack that now, I think, because of this turn into kind of more conservative ideas in terms of culture as well. But also enhanced discourse on what the nation is, what the nation state is, obviously augmenting nationalistic sentiments. And I think that's a good point also to bring in to this discussion, because the film comments a lot on that as well, in terms of national identities. And the difference between the then and the now is clearly, of course, when in these types of world expositions, like the Expo 58, we're presenting national identity through, the dress of culture. But nonetheless, I think this progressive spirit that you just described had to do with a desire, to say the least, to actually connect with other nations and present, let's say, cultural tendencies that are the silver thread amongst, Europeans or what have you. I think that was also very pertinent during the first 5 years of the 90s as well, because of the European Union and, the common currency, etc., etc. And it's interesting to see how little it lasted, and that now we're going into, and again, looking at it through the eyes and the performance itself of culture, that we are not interested. I mean, it's very, very interesting to think of it like the official lips of nation states, let's put it this way, are not interested in investing in progressive culture anymore, are not interested as much to create synapses and different connections and common points. They are looking at culture, and that, of course, is just my reading, and I would say contemporary art even more, as cultural capital, as a great export product that instates their power, but the content of it is of no interest anymore, it seems. It's just the points, the likes on Facebook, the this, the that. It's a different way of valorizing culture as well, that somehow didn't even exist back then in such a conservative way and in such kind of a square logic format. And this is something I think the film, it's very subtle, and it's kind of an afterthought that one has when they see The Gift. But after a second and third viewing, I was thinking about it very much of, and I'm happy that you mentioned it again, that yeah, there is not this dialogue of like, yeah, we're going to do this presentation, to take, for instance, the Venice Biennials and all these structures that, of course, you have nation representations and pavilions, etc. There is no desire to actually inquire in a not just a superficial level, what is it that we're presenting and to what does it relate? Is it going to be expensive enough? Will we have lots of visitors? And will it be woke enough, I think, is a latest question. But it all remains somehow in a first level reading. And for me, this is something that the film makes very obvious, and that made me very happy.
What I really wanted to build through this dialogue of the four women, so the four judges, the four fundamental freedoms, is this kind of this just addition of this added regulations or hoops through which to jump, because of course it's an insolvable equation, and we all know this more and more. When you're applying with any project, any grant request you're making, will it help the local community? Will it develop democracy? I mean, how many different variations for the same project do we have in our books when we're trying to suit one of the clients, if you want? So, and I think this is where, kind of coming back to this relationship between the cultural producer, when I say cultural producer, I mean just, artists, curators, institutions, because we are all
cultural workers, let's put it this
workers, way. Absolutely. It's an ethical project. It's an ethical exercise in cultural production that I really want to drive. But then again, it is this kind of questioning of, what are we willing to say yes to get the money to produce something?
It reminded me of a colleague that proposed a proposition for a European biennial, and the response of the board or the judging committee, which was a local one, was, oh, post-colonialism, we did that last year, as if it's if it's a subject matter that is just for one edition and then it's done and you don't need to talk about it again. So I think, again, to go back to the film, I think also, and to specifically mention the four freedoms that the judges, I've spoken about that also when writing a text about your work. The language used, this very corporate way of addressing culture, that again, you're reflecting on these mechanisms of funding that exist within the European Union, I think that was spot on, because it shows the contemporary feeling and idea on having requests from cultural workers and cultural producers that put everything in a frame, as I said before, of cultural capital, of entrepreneurship, with terminology that is a terminology of a multinational company rather than a cultural realm. It's not always bad, and it's not necessarily 100% bad, but I think maybe we're having too much of it. And I also thought that in the film that was a very successful comment, that it was quite obvious that you were critiquing the way power, because of course the infrastructures of power are these as well, always like funding bodies, mechanisms, yeah, I thought that was also very good.
These are the mechanisms they're very universal, they are really cross-territory, and it is this whole kind of corporization of this kind of cultural machine, which is which is what I think loads of us here are somehow trying to just find different ways to dealing with.
I mean, in terms of the research of the film, which I feel also is a culmination of a process and a practice that you've been going on for more than 10 years with, what do you feel is the next step, or what is it that you would take with you from this project for a future project?
It was actually the casting part which made me really think. So one of the agents for the actress was kind of saying, well, will you include the most favored nations clause? It comes from World Trade Organization language in the 50s, where they were trying to kind of ascertain, equal trading rights for different nations. Now this clause came into entertainment contracts. But back to what we're talking about, this kind of tokenistic usage of cultural producers based on their territory or the politics, identity politics. We have a similar thing. We have this, the system is kind of ascribing on paper to this most favored nations clause, but we all know it's not true. So I'm working on a new project. Actually, the start for it will be my solo exhibition next year in Salzburg, in Museum der Moderne, which is titled The Most Favored Nations, but I am starting to work on a new film, which is going from there.
Oh, I'm very much looking forward to it. Good luck with everything, and keep me updated.
Thank you.